Hello and welcome. In this lab, you will manage configuration changes to your Kubernetes application using ConfigMap and Portainer. You can find a PDF file with the full list of the commands you will run under the resources attached to this lab. Please download this PDF file now and keep it handy to help you with typing the commands for this lab. We created version 3 of the REST API server deployment in the previous lab. The calls to the Fibonacci REST API are logged in the log file. But the file is hard-coded as /logs/system.log. We can do better than that. In this lab, we will set the log file name and path using a configuration. Check function getLog file in the REST API implementation. It attempts to read the log file path and log file name from a configuration file. The path to the configuration file is stored in an environment variable called config_file. We will use Kubernetes features to create this configuration file and fill in this environment variable. Check contents of file log_configmap.yaml. A Kubernetes config map is an API object used to store non-confidential data in key value pairs. Pods can consume config maps as environment variables, command line arguments, or as configuration files in a volume. We will consume the config map log_configmap as a configuration file in a volume. The config map defines config parameters, path, and file name for the log file, and fills them with placeholder values in lines 10 to 11. We will use a web-based tool called Portainer later in this lab to fill in proper config values. Take a look at version 4 of the backend deployment in file backend_deployment_v4.yaml. It is similar to the version 3 of the deployment in file backend_deployment_v3.yaml, which we deployed in the previous lab. Look at the pod template starting at line 16. Version 4 adds the following features related to configuration. In lines 39 to 44, a Kubernetes volume with the name config is created based on the config map log_configmap. The volume will surface the contents of the config map as a file named config.ini. In lines 33 to 34, the container in the pod mounts said volume to the path /var/private. This makes the contents of the config map accessible to the container as file /var/private/config.ini. In lines 27 to 29, an environment variable config_file is set to the value /var/private/config.ini. The above features in the version 4 deployment makes a configuration file accessible to the container via the environment variable config_file. The function getLog file in the REST API implementation can read the values for log file path and log file name from the configuration file. Therefore, a custom name and path to the log file is made possible. Launch your terminal and make sure you are at the Fibonacci sample/k8 directory. Run the following command to create the config map. List config maps using this command. You see the new config map created. Get more info about the config map using the describe command. More information about the config map is printed to the console. Please deploy version 4 of the deployment using this command. Please wait for a minute for the new pods to be deployed and the old pods to be terminated. Now check the deployment history. The new deployment is listed as Fibonacci Backend v4. Let's install Portainer. Portainer is a container management platform that provides an easy-to-use web user interface to manage your container workloads. Portainer can be used to manage a variety of container infrastructures. In this series, we will use Portainer's web UI to easily edit the configuration changes for our application and to manage the Kubernetes cluster in general. You can find links to Portainer documentation under the resources attached to this lab. There is also a link to Portainer for Kubernetes GitHub repository, which includes useful information such as options to install Portainer for a Kubernetes cluster. We got the command to install Portainer, which we will use now from this GitHub repository. Run the following command to install Portainer on your Kubernetes cluster. Wait for 1 to 2 minutes for the installation to complete, then launch Portainer in your browser using this link. You will need to set up a username and a password for the first time. Click on Get Started. You will see your Kubernetes cluster environment under the Environments list. It lists properties of the K8 cluster, such as the number of CPUs and the allocated RAM to the cluster. Click on the K8 environment. You are taken to the dashboard view where you can have a list of K8 resources that are present on the K8 environment. Click on Applications. You are greeted with the Fibonacci Backend application. Click on it. A page comes with all the information you need to know about the application. Read through it to familiarize yourself with its contents. Scroll down to the end where you will see a list of the pods under the deployment. Notice the Actions column at the far right of the table. For each pod, you can click Logs to see the pod logs. You can also click Console to launch a terminal into the pod's container right inside the browser. From the left navigation pane, click on the kubectl shell. You will have access to a terminal inside the browser where you can issue commands against your Kubernetes cluster. Run this command to list all Kubernetes resources in the cluster. Feel free to browse through the UI of Portainer to get familiar with its features. Let's now edit the config map for the backend. Click on Config Maps and Secrets from the left pane. Our config map, log config map, appears on a table to the right. Click on it. You can edit the config data of your application right in the browser. You will initially see placeholder text. Replace it with proper values. Click Update Config Map button at the end of the page to save the changes. Let's put Portainer to good use again. Navigate to Applications from the left pane. Click on the Fibonacci Backend Deployment application. Scroll down to the Pods and right to the Actions column. Remember, all the pods are replicas of the same pod template from the deployment. Pick any pod and launch a bash terminal to the container in the pod. Issue this command to print the contents of the configuration file. Issue this command to print the value of the environment variable config_file. The container in the pod has access to the configuration data as we configured it. Let's figure the Fibonacci of 100. Launch this URL in the browser. Note that the version is coming as v4.0 as we configured it. Now, check if the logs made it to the custom log file on the host machine. The log file is there. Check the contents of the file. It has the result of the Fibonacci of 100 that we just ran. Let's do a progress check of the application at this point. In this lab, you have managed configuration changes to your Kubernetes application using a config map. You also installed Portainer and used it to edit the config map and to manage the Kubernetes cluster in general. That's it for this lab. Thank you, and see you in the next lecture.